Hello everyone. In this video, I will quickly demonstrate how versioning works in Kubernetes. So far, all the documentation that I've read, they haven't explained versioning properly. So when I was reading all this documentation, it was confusing me. So I just want to make sure that there are actual people understanding, how that works and why it matters. So I'll go to Kubernetes documentation. And Kubernetes.io, and it is highly important for you to know your way around in this documentation website, because when you use Kubernetes, you realize that there are so many concepts that you may not know, and understanding navigation in this documentation will help you quite a bit. So any reference points that you need, you have to go to reference tab here, and then we'll see a Kubernetes API version or reference version 1.17. So let's step back and understand what exactly Kubernetes versioning and how and what pieces actually are versioned, and also what is API, what is API server, and then how they are versioned as well. So Kubernetes, it is released as a suite of products, and then if you go to let's get getting started. Actually, let's go to concepts, and then if you look at the what is Kubernetes, and actually not this one, Kubernetes components, sorry. So you'll see a suite of products that are part of the Kubernetes platform, and you'll see Kubernetes controller, cloud controller manager, Kube API server, which we're going to be spending most of our time here with the Kubernetes API server, and Etsy and the Kube scheduler. And then also you'll see that there are actual three main components or main elements that make up Kubernetes, and that is, the first one is the control plane, and the second one is all the nodes, and the third one is the client itself. So when a Kubernetes is shipped, it will be shipped with all these components or updated versions of all these components. So they're going to be following the same versioning schema, and that is semantic versioning, but also they're going to have the same version. So let's actually step back again and then understand the release and understanding the actual components that are installed and set up on your cluster. So when a Kubernetes makes a release, let's say version 1.17, all the components in that release are versioned with the same number, right? Or same version. But Kubernetes allows you to install these pieces separately, or let's say these pieces with separate versions or different versions. Of course, there has to be some compatibility between those parts, but and then which we're going to be looking at how Kubernetes support different versions, but that is a key point here. So for instance, your Kube API server might have, let's say, 1.16, but your Kube controller might have 1.15 or something, and then it is called component SKU. So each version supports different versions of the other components. And the second piece is, of course, the kubelet and kube proxy, those two components that are installed on each node. And again, you may have different versions of these kubelet and kube proxy, so that kind of gives you some sort of a freedom in terms of which version and which version you use for each component and how you're going to deploy the new versions. Because it's not an easy thing, right? I mean, you have to make sure that the consumers or the developers that using this Kubernetes cluster, if you're a platform team or some sort of an infrastructure team in in your company, you have to make sure that those people are actually still consuming your pieces, and the Kubernetes cluster is still operational. So the versioning matters here. So that's the first versioning you'll notice. So, you know, a global version number, and each pieces are versioned separately, but when they're released, they will have the same version. But since they are versioned separately, that gives you the flexibility to have different components with different versions. And the third piece is the client itself. So client is there are a couple. Actually, most of the time when you hear client in Kubernetes platform, that means it is kubectl or kubectl. Also, of course, there are client libraries that kubectl actually uses. If you like reading source code, go ahead and check their GitHub account, Kubernetes GitHub, and you're gonna be seeing how those things are. So actually, this is the Kubernetes platform itself. But if you go to, actually, let's go here. Let's go to main account here, and that is the Kubernetes. And underneath, you'll see Kubernetes itself, and of course, kubectl. If we has to be here. Yeah, so kubectl. The kubectl repo is actually, it has the packages and all the stuff here, as you see, apply, you know, apps and command whatever. But also, if you go to Kubernetes and then Kubernetes itself, you'll also see the actual command line here under package and under kubectl. And if you look at the source code over here, you'll see the command line tool has kind of referencing all these packages. So, and what I'm explaining is that, you know, this is a critical piece that you're going to be using quite extensively in your Kubernetes life. And of course, you can still use all those libraries that are under the Kubernetes or kubectl repo here in GitHub. As you see, they're all the packages referenced. But you can also hit Kubernetes, and by the way, kubectl uses all those packages and make calls, Restful API calls to the API server. So let's go back here. And so even though Kube API server itself, the software, may be versioned like with, let's say, 1.17, when you look at the actual API, the versioning will change. And that is really important here, because if you don't understand that part, you're not going to effectively use Kubernetes. You're not going to understand what APIs and what versions and all that stuff. You're going to see problems with your kubectl calls. For instance, if you try to apply a configuration file, which is usually a YAML file or a JSON file that has definitions of your objects that you want to create on Kubernetes, the problem will, you know, happen. What problems will happen is that, like, you're going to get schema errors and all that stuff because your kubectl version, well, first of all, it's not compatible, or maybe may not be compatible with the Kube API server that you are running on. Also, you may be trying to use an object definition in a schema that is not available yet. So, so critical piece here is that make sure that your kubectl is using the right or a compatible version of Kube API server. So how do you check that? Before we actually explain the Kube API versioning here, let's look at the command line a little bit. I'm not going to be able to show much here because the cluster I'm using is my company's cluster, so I'm not going to be able to give you much here, but it doesn't matter. By the way, I already have an alias here, and K, that means kubectl. It already points at my in the context file or in the configuration file under kube.kube folder. It already has all the context and everything needed. And let me actually turn this off. Okay. So if I do like API version, not API versions actually, if I say version, okay, that version gives me two important pieces of information. The first one is client version. So client version is the client, the kubectl that I'm using. And the second important piece is server version, and the server version is the Kubernetes API server version. So as you see that here, we use a .15 and the minor version, of course, and this is the patch version. The zeros are patch, and that's a 10. And the other minor version is 117 or 17. So they're kind of compatible, but of course we're going to look at the documentation and says what's the SKU like, and I'll show you what it is. So let's actually move this over here. So the second thing is the API versioning. So let's look at the Kubernetes API, and it kind of explains that, but I wasn't really satisfied until I understand the basics. So I'll give you the basics, and of course you can always come back here and read more. So there are two things that you need to be aware of, and that is, the first one is the API version itself. So the way that Kubernetes versions its API is it follows three categories. The first one is general availability category, or also known as general acceptance category. The second one is beta, and the third one is alpha. So the alpha level is it has well, the name actually suggests if you are a software engineer, you probably know what alpha means. It's a very a first version of something. It's not exactly a version of anything, actually. It's just kind of a in progress, ongoing a branch where things change frequently, so you can't really depend on it. But if you want to see latest and greatest, the alpha level is for you. And then you just go ahead and check all the information here. The second one is beta level. The beta level is more well tested, of course, and then it is mostly safer than alpha level, and it is enabled by default and all that stuff. And the stable level is, well, I don't really see any maybe convention or any extra suffixes or prefixes here. It is just v1. So let's look at this here, and you'll see that API v1 and APIs whatever. So when you form your URLs, RESTful API URLs, the API version matters. So usually it is v1. Currently we are on v1 API version, and I'll explain what exactly the API version and how it's related to the version here, which kind of confused me when I was first learning Kubernetes, and I couldn't find a proper definition or a documentation that actually explains between those two numbers here. And this is how things goes. Kubernetes, releases things, right? Like 1.15, 1.17, whatever. So when they release things, they add new objects, they remove old objects, or deprecate things, or they, improve things, right? So what they improve in terms of, from our perspective, for user perspective, which what matters to us at this point is Kube API server, because we consume Kubernetes through that Kube API server. There's no other way other than the API server itself. So when you look at the version 1.16, let's say, I'm just making this up. I can't tell it is guaranteed, but what I know is that, so you may see, let's say, an attribute or a new object in alpha level if you are on 1.16, but when you go to 1.17, right, that object which was in the alpha level in 1.16 may be propagated, may be copied or moved to the beta level. So that's a really important distinction here. So as they release more and more newer versions of this global system, or the Kubernetes and all of its components, you'll realize that the API, even though still versioned in 3 pieces, changing and evolving. And then objects are moved from one level to another. So that's the relationship between the API versioning and the Kubernetes versioning. So of course, there are still some extra versions here. So let's say you see v1 beta 1, or you can see v1 beta 2, whatever, as they add more beta versions. That gives them a better flexibility and more reliability in terms of usage, because if you change the objects too much, it is really hurting the developers, because they have to support the new versions or new. Let's imagine that if they were actually if they were actually versioning the resources or objects. Again, if you don't know exactly what an object is a pod or deployment, a service, an ingress, they're all objects, Kubernetes objects or API objects. If they were versioning at that level, developers had to keep track all those things constantly, and then make sure that comply with the new versions, whatever. But they version at API level, which is more, which is a broader versioning container or whatever. So you can stay safe for a while or for a longer while with that API version until they, in their one of those newer version of Kubernetes, they completely deprecate that API. Which happens not so fast, so you are good about that. So there are a couple places where you're gonna see the API version, as well as the other piece that I haven't explained is the API groups. So they have multiple API groups, and they're all combined to create one thing. So when you, let's say, reference an object in your REST endpoint, you combine API version, you combine API group, you combine the resource itself, the object itself in the resource URL, and all of those things change with the global version. So as the API server evolves, of course, it affects the URL and the things like that. Of course, it doesn't really affect much, which it shouldn't affect much actually. But again, it is what it is, and that's the relationship between those two. So the API groups are what they did is, they just kind of grouped their resources, their objects into multiple different groups, kind of a namespaces, so you can better understand what group or what category the objects belong to, for instance. And so for instance, a batch is a group here, and we have version 1, and we'll see how that all come together in the versioning scheme over here. And then so you have this scheme here, which is group name and a version. So, and that group name and the version, of course, is API version. So v1 or v1 beta 1 or v1 beta 2 or v1 alpha 1, whatever. That's how the version part of the scheme actually works here. So for the legacy applications, initially Kubernetes didn't have this concept, API groups. So what they did is they just had the API or pod, some of the replication controller, some primitives that came up with Kubernetes initially. They didn't have this concept, so they put everything in this just generic, they call it core group. But eventually they evolved into multiple groups, and for instance, like you will see apps, which has deployment and all that pieces. So actually, let's go to here in the API definition. This is something you're gonna need to know quite a bit. I mean, you don't have to memorize it, but at least you need to know where it is and how you can use it. So let's go to Actually, not here. Let's go to reference here, and let's go to Kubernetes API reference v17 or version 17. So you're gonna see some categories here like workload APIs, containers, right? They're all workload stuff, deployment, job, and pod, and all that stuff. You will have some service APIs and endpoints, for instance, ingress, and whatnot. So let's go to and look at deployment, which this is something you'll be using quite a bit in your Kubernetes deployment, because that's, I mean, modern way of creating deployments and controlling your deployments and all that stuff. And it's a part of an apps group. So if I can, all right, so here you see that, let's look at the, not daemon set, okay, here, okay. So if you look at this, you'll see, so you may have the question like how I'm supposed to, for my Kubernetes configuration files, what documentation do I have, and what the schema looks like. This is where you have to go. And then if you look at this, by the way, you'll see that this deployment has different versions, right? And different, actually has different, different versions like v1, beta 2, beta 1, and beta 1. I don't exactly know what's the difference between those two, but there's something weird here. Maybe one is, no, they're all the same, I guess. Yeah, I don't know, maybe something, a problem, or, oh, actually, okay, so the extensions, and if you look at the URL below, you'll see here, it's actually, this one is apps and this one is extensions. So the difference is, Kubernetes may actually represent some of these groups internally and differently. So even though you think that it is an apps group, that that thing might be translated to a different internal representation of that group, or a different group completely, API group I'm talking about. So previously, I think it's still ongoing, I don't know, but currently, or previously at least, I know that when all the apps, which is this apps category, was actually translated to extensions. So this has the extensions app group, and this has the apps. So perhaps they've recently introduced the actual apps, and that's they currently or recently kind of created this new internal apps category, whatever, but this is what it is. So if you look at this, you'll see API version. That's the thing that we'll be having. Actually, let's go to, so anyway, so yeah. So let's look at an example and let's see how the API version looks like. So I'm just gonna go back to the Kubernetes. I was just showing you where there are two places where you're gonna be specifying the API version. The first one is here, and if you use kubectl, the kubectl reads this field API version, and then knows how to form the URL for you to make the request to the API server. So also, if you look at, you'll see like apps v1, that's the API version, right? And it has your container or your group name, and sometimes you'll see the group names look like a URL, so just don't be surprised about that. And then there's some like a v1 course, and this is again the original category or API group that didn't have any a named group or a name. So here, for instance, you'll see all the fields that are necessary, and then you'll see what exactly I'm talking about when I show you an actual Kubernetes definition file. And if you click here, it'll take you to the actual objects, or there's basically a hierarchy here. If you are familiar with object-oriented programming, this is exactly what it is. It's composition of objects, and you'll see all the other things. And of course, this list is usually like this object appears in this object here as well. So it's a composition of objects, and it shows where this object, which is non-resource rule, we run, and this is the API group, by the way. So, and if you do the API version, you just do authorization This 8 means there are like 8 letters between K and Kubernetes. In the word Kubernetes, there are eight letters between K and S. So it is usually kind of an abbreviation, which is very common in programming world. Kubernetes.io and /v1. That's how you do API version here. So again, as you move into different Kubernetes, the platform version or API server version, the v1 version may have different objects than the version, let's say, version 1.15 or 1.00, right? So the v1 API version, let me clarify that v1 API version in, let's say, Kubernetes 1.17 may have a new field or a new object definition, or may deprecate an existing object, right, that was in version 1.4 or something. Just keep that in mind, and that's how the relationship goes between those two. All right, so let's look at an example of Kubernetes. Let's say deployment definition example. Okay. All right, let's look at this image here. All right, so you'll see. All right, there's a GIF. Let's open a new tab. Okay, so you have this deployment, right? And previously it was extensions, now it's apps, and you have metadata, and you have spec and template, and the way that you read this and the way that you form this YAML file is to look at the Kubernetes API, or there are other options here, and that is with the command line here. So if you do if you do explain and say pod, that actually tells you what fields that you have to fill in here as well. So API version, all that stuff. So anything that is required, usually marked as required. So these fields, by the way, they're all required. So they don't even specify that, but they're all required, except for the status. And then, so if you look at, for instance, to k explain pod dot let's say metadata dot template or something with a template, or let's look at metadata here, that actually gives you the metadata, the fields in the metadata. So you have two options. You can either use kubectl, or you can either look at the Kubernetes API online to see what fields you need. And so this is how it looks like, all labels and whatever and all that stuff. So there are other thing, and that is, if you look at the API versions, you'll see what API versions that your server supports, and that is really critical. And because if you trying to, you know, by the way, these are API versions at 1.15. Remember, like we did just API version here, and that gave me the server version, and that is in 1.15, right? 1.15. So these are the API versions. That's important. These are the API versions specified in 1.15. So the list might be different in 1.17. You may not see some of these things, or you may, for instance, like app v1 beta 1 might be deprecated in the 1.17 or whatever, right? So only available version might be v1 beta 2, or those two things might be gone, and we might see apps v1 beta 3, or whatever in beta 2 might be shipped to just the apps v1 in the new version of Kubernetes. The other thing is, what was the other one? Let's look at this. And then the other thing is API resources. So these are the available resources there are in your Kubernetes server version, whatever, the 150, and then that means you can when you try to use jobs, for instance, you can see it's under batch and there's no really a namespace, whatever. So that's how you see what resources that are available to you by just running API resources. So let's look at this. The resource is an interesting term because people usually understand a resource or confuse a resource with the object. Not exactly. So the resource is when you hear a resource, just think of an API endpoint. Because you just hit that API endpoint, and then you get there's a RESTful API endpoint, right? So you do like get, post, patch, put, all those HTTP verbs that you can use with those API endpoints, and they are the resource. You can't really know. I mean, you know, but don't rely on the fact that the Kubernetes are just perhaps representing them as some objects, but actually internally, Kubernetes is free to store those things or represent those resources however it wants. So that's why I'm saying that just keep that resource, your resource understanding or whatever you understand from the term resource at the URL level or endpoint level. But the actual things are being created after you say post to that resource is called object. So pod object, deployment object, and all that stuff. So that's why I'm saying, like, if you post a deployment, your deployment configuration to deployment resource, that deployment will be split into multiple objects since you define a pod there on other resources or other objects, right? So Kubernetes will create a deployment object for you. Kubernetes will deploy or will create a service replica set object for you, or multiple replica sets object, depending on how you configure that. And the Kubernetes will create multiple pod objects for you. If you have a replica set, let's say 5, whatever, 10, more than one. So just keep that in mind. And let's go back to Kubernetes documentation again, and the reference, actually. Well, you can actually look at all these things here too, like APIs, extensions, v1, beta 1. This is actually how. So this is when you form your URL. This is how it looks like. I mean, whatever the rest of it, but when the version in your URLs, this is how it looks like in your URL. So API 1, but if you use named groups, it is APIs, extensions. Just look at these APIs. This is a RESTful API convention, right? If you have multiple of one resource, you pluralize it. I just couldn't say that word. So for instance, like if there are like multiple person, you just say people, right, in your in your RESTful API. So that's the same exact convention that you're seeing here. So it says I want to use API, under APIs, I want to use extensions and v1 beta 1. Extensions, apps, whatever you have for your user API group. So that's that. And this is, if you want to access Kubernetes through different mediums other than kubectl, you can read this. So what I was actually going to show you is the release queues. So all right, let's go back here. The release version queue support policy, and that's important. So it says if you are, let's say, on Kube API server 1.13, the other instances again, remember, like, Kubernetes might in the platform, they might be versioned individually, right? Actually, they're versioned individually, but they may have different versions. So if your Kube API server is 1.13, the other components, remember the other components, controller manager, whatever, they can be at 1.13 or 1.12. So if they're older version of the Kubernetes, Kube API server, they're still supported. But you have to make sure that it is only one version behind. So you can't use 1.11, for instance. You cannot. You have to be one version behind in your other components. That's the SKU. That's how the SKU works. So the kubelet, in your nodes, right? If your Kube API server, by the way, usually all this skewing works from the Kube API server, which is the main component, main communicator, main medium between not just you and the Kubernetes, but also all of the Kubernetes components. Kubernetes components don't usually talk to each other directly. They talk to each other through Kube API. So we may see some different API technologies. For instance, you may see some Restful APIs, but also protobuf and gRPC or whatever, all that stuff internally in Kubernetes. So to increase the efficiency of the API calls, right? So if you are Kube API server at 1.13, your kubelet might be 1.13, 1.12, and 1.11. So it's not exactly the same for everything. Different components follow or comply or are compatible with different API versions. So the way that you are behind, it might change from kubelet to other Kubernetes components. All right, so of course, you may have multiple Kube API servers, by the way. There's nothing that prevents you having like multiple API servers. Just if you want to increase the a load balancing or whatever, you can have multiple API servers. But if they're at different versions, that affects the skewing here as well. Because now, for instance, if you have two Kube API servers installed on your Kube cluster, and if they're like 1.13 and 1.12, your kubelet must be 1.13 and 1.11, whatever. So it affects how your kubelet will work as well, or your kubelet's compatible version as well. All right, so you can read the rest of it, but what I want to show you is kubectl, which is usually what you really care about. And if your Kube API server is 1.13, the kubectl is supported 1.13, 1.14, 1.13, and 1.12. All right, so that is important, right? So it's supported, means like it's compatible, but you may still see some working example. Like for instance, in my case, I'm pretty far ahead of the, my server version, but it still works, but it may not work reliably. That's the problem. So like I'm 1.17, but this fellow over here is 1.15, right? Where is that? So it's 1.15. So ideally, the versions of the kubectl that is, reliably supported is 1.16 or 1.14, right? So it's one minor version ahead or one minor version behind of the server Kube API. So I'm 17. It works, but if I see any problem, I'll see a problem because of that compatibility issues, and they don't really tell you they fully support it, as from this skewing example here. All right, so this is how the versioning works. And I will definitely urge you to just go ahead and understand the versioning if you want to use Kubernetes. It doesn't matter if you are the cluster administrator or if you are just a consumer as a developer. using this Kubernetes. If you don't quite understand this concept here, the basic concepts of Kubernetes, as well as the versioning and how versioning works, I'm sure you're going to run into problems, and you're not going to know how exactly you can solve them because of the compatibility issues. They're not going to understand. You're not going to be aware or realize that it's actually because of the versioning problems. And that happened to me, and then I spent quite a bit of time because I didn't know that it was actually some just versioning problem or a version incompatibility problem. So it was not fun. So until next time, you have a great day ahead.